Tessa Hadley, we're going to talk about your book, Free Love, it's called in English, and it's new in Danish, and it's the first novel of your 8 novels that come in Danish, and we can read it. And that's why I think we should start letting you have just a minute to tell us about you and your authorship for the Danish readers.
Well, this is my 8th novel, which makes it sound as if I've been writing forever. But in fact, I was a late starter, and I published my first novel in English when I was 46. But why did it take me so long? I was writing for all the 20 years before that, but failing, writing terrible, dead books that were other people's books, and I didn't know how to write them. And then wonderfully, I sort of found my way through to the very small terrain that felt natural to me, and published this first book when I was 46. And and now I think partly because of that late start, I don't work insanely. I only work for so many hours on any day when I'm not doing anything else, is how I think about it. But I have kept on pushing and writing more, and I should be touching wood at this point. Yes, I can touch my seat. I'm touching wood. I've never had a huge blockage, a sense that I had nothing to say. I've gone down wrong paths and had to go back and start again and do something different. But that's I was still always writing, and I still feel that there's some more in me while I'm still here.
That's great. And I know that we'll get more of your books translated into Danish soon.
I think they're going to translate The Past, which is the novel I wrote 2 novels before Free Love, in February next year.
We're looking forward to that.
Yeah.
But this one is set in the 60s in England. And I'm wondering, do you think that this period of time appeals to the Danes too?
In a way, I don't know. I have to hope so. I think so. I have a strong feeling that Denmark was part of that great, strange break that happened across Western Europe in the 60s, where a post-war, rather grey world of recovery and austerity was sort of suddenly smashed across. Oh, and not only austerity and greyness, but also hierarchy, something conventional and rigid inherited from before the war in manners and relationships. And then the counterculture came, and a new generation kind of tore the rule book up and said, well, we're going to just do everything differently. We can just start life all over again as if it had never been invented before. And I think that story, I mean, it's obviously as true in France as it is in England, if not more so. And they've never got over it really in France. And I think it should reach readers in Denmark too.
I think it's a period we keep going back to it in movies.
Well, I think when I was writing it, I had a sense that I was doing some roots work. I was feeling down from where we are now, from my sort of perspective, having lived through quite a few decades. I was a child in the 60s. And I was feeling down for where this story started. Now, that's, of course, a fallacy, a countercultural fallacy. You never start fresh. You're always inheriting the decades and the centuries that came before. But nonetheless, there's some truth that it's the source from which so much of our present politics and culture flows still.
And the possibilities we have as women, a lot of that.
And there's so much that. Although, of course, as in the novel, so much of feminism and women's liberation was kind of slightly on pause in the 60s while men decided that they could have free love and et cetera, et cetera. And it sort of was almost waiting for the 70s, I think, for that to truly take off as the important second wave of feminism. Yeah.
In the novel, we follow this woman called Phyllis, and she's 40. And at a dinner party, she meets a young man called Nicholas or Nicky. But first, could you tell us what is Phyllis' life like before she meets Nikki?
I always knew where I was going to open this novel before I started writing. It opens with Phyllis making up her face at her dressing table, and that seemed absolutely archetypally her to me. And all those decades of women who had literally put on their face at the dressing table, making themselves lovely, making themselves charming, making themselves attractive, making their homes attractive and their food attractive. And she is getting ready for this dinner party. And what is she? She's full of pleasure, I think. It's so not a story of an unhappy woman. She has her moments because she has her troubles, but it's the story of someone who's cut out to live strongly and to live well. She has a kind of courage about her. At times when I'm writing her, I'm thinking she's really quite silly. But I always thought she's got great courage and bravado. She follows through with things almost stubbornly, almost to the point of daftness sometimes.
Yeah, she's happy. And in the beginning, she's bubbly and she's excited. And
I so didn't want to write the story of an unhappy woman trapped in a miserable conventional marriage who finds joy and freedom through a young lover. That seems to me such an old-fashioned story in a way. I actually give Phyllis great contentment in her life, and I think a very lovely, interesting, complicated husband. You might even think he's more interesting and complicated than her lover. Whatever, but it could be. It wouldn't have made much of a novel. That Phyllis never kissed Nicky in the garden in that evening of that dinner party, never went through that door into a new life. She could have lived on contentedly, going to the film club and sort of attending church in a slightly sceptical way and adoring her son and tussling with her daughter. That life could have continued, but I've always been fascinated by accidents. An accident happens to her in a way that evening in the garden, which then she steps through the opening that the accident makes into a new life.
Exactly. I thought maybe we should hear a little bit where we're inside Phyllis's head.
Yes.
What happens in there?
Something that happens at that dinner party. Nicky arrived drunk, late, in a dirty shirt, and he disconcerts Phyllis in a way she isn't used to. She's used to being in control of every situation, a lovely, attractive, flirty woman, flirting with men, not doing anything foolish or wrong. And at one point, she touches his shoulder in a kind of placating, flirty way, but her hand is really cold because she's been fishing ice cubes out of the ice bucket. And he recoils from her. It's purely because she's cold, but she thinks it's something more. And it's this is the accident, really. This is the moment when the safe, contented life that she thought she had inside her mind kind of crumbles inside her mind, and she sees everything, as it were, upside down from how it had been before. So this is this moment. Phyllis was hardly listening to Nicky, except to note his disapproval. She was still reacting to his recoil from her when she squeezed his shoulder. She'd begun joking recently about becoming an old woman. She'd pictured herself sliding across serenely into middle age, fulfilled and busy with her house and her hobbies. But all this cheerful resignation, she recognised now, had been a sham, mere self-deception. It hadn't seriously occurred to her in her deeper awareness that anything had changed or must ever change. She'd taken for granted that at her core, her sexual self would continue forever, a nugget of radioactive material charged with its power, irreducible. Now, she was afraid that she'd sickened Nicky when she touched him, just as she'd been sickened by the leering older men who'd groped at her when she was his age. It was her turn to be old and repulsive. Wasn't that what he meant by what he was saying? Women like her, and of her class, were repulsive to the young. Phyllis hadn't known that the young had this power to reduce the present of the middle-aged to rubble.
Ouch. Is the affair also like a desperate attempt to savor her youth?
Yes, I think it is. It's a sense that you arrive at the far shore of your youth thinking that might be over, and then you realize there's a huge untapped reservoir of life you haven't lived. You might not have realized that, but that moment opens up that truth for her. And yes, then she throws herself with desperation into the pursuit of Nicky, who really only kissed her in the garden because he thought it was a nice bourgeois, scandalous thing to do, and isn't quite sure what he meant by it at all, but certainly did not think they were embarking on an affair, and is astonished when she turns up at his room wanting more. But, he's a man, settles into it.
Yes, he does. And Nicky, the young man, he lives in a special part of London. I think it's called the Grove.
Yeah.
Can you describe that a little bit?
It's kind of Notting Hill, Ladbroke Grove, which was one of the sort of throbbing hearts of the counterculture. It was an area that had grand Georgian and Victorian houses, still does have grand Georgian and Victorian houses in it, and it's gone through a wonderful sort of sociological change in that it had become a poor area, a lot of immigrants, a lot of Caribbean immigrants and Jewish immigrants. And then, because it was cheap and scruffy, then the counterculture moved in alongside those groups, and everybody who was anybody who sort of was cool at one time had passed through there. Then, of course, it became trendy and ludicrously expensive, and is now mixed still in that special London way where the poor and the rich live cheek by jowl. But it's very difficult. You wouldn't be able to buy a flat there anymore. Whereas what I love in my book, by the way, just in passing, is that Phyllis gets a mortgage for pennies on 2 scruffy flats. And I just hope she's hung on to them, because if she's still alive and she's an old lady now, she's really very rich.
Yes, you could be a speculant.
Yes, exactly.
What does it spark in her to meet Nicky and his group of artistic and cool friends? Opens something up.
It really does open something, and the obvious answer is it opens something sexually and passionately in her, because her marriage, for complicated reasons, has been friendly and companionable. And at some point she says to herself that she and Roger, I can't remember exactly how I put it, but they had met each other innocently, like children, and that wasn't everything. There were other ways of being with a man. So there's that. But it isn't only that. There's a scene in the book which, again, I had in my head right from before I started writing. I knew it was a pivot of the book, where the very first whole night they spend together, they make love, Nicky falls asleep after they've had a little row where he accuses her husband of being sort of politically, he's sending napalm to bomb children. In fact, her husband is a really, really decent socialist, if anything, but he's in the Foreign Office, he's establishment. And Phyllis sits up all night, and she's cold, but she won't get comfortable. She sits on a hard chair in her petticoat, and she takes in, all in one night, in a few hours, an absolute change in her perspective on the world. And although she's not an intellectual, she's never going to become a great reader, and in the end, she isn't even going to become a political activist. She's not. She finds that marching is sort of silly, and she can't do it very convincingly. But something in her view on life changes absolutely once and for all that night, and she, if you like, she undoes her belief in the solid, sane, rationalist perspective that she's been brought up to, and she sees things from upside down. And I actually think that really did happen in the 60s to many, many people. And in the end, it sort of happened to all of us, that our view of everything was turned upside down in that era. And there I wanted to have that happening to one woman in one night. Doesn't change anything. She doesn't as I say, become an activist, it just changes her. And that happened to many people.
It's a very strong scene, actually, and it seems almost utopian that a 40-year-old would get such a change in the view of the whole world, but also very refreshing that it happened.
I believe it happened. I think I almost know people to whom that happened. That there's sort of like shedding a veil from in front of your eyes and seeing everything differently. It can sometimes happen through a book or a documentary or somebody. In this case, it's Nikki talking to her. And it is just the small change of his sort of radical leftist talk. It doesn't do to him what it does to her, but the small change that he sort of throws her, sees everything differently.
Sees everything different.
Yeah.
It also comes with a price, and that's one thing in the novel that's really nice too, that we get to go and see what it does to the daughter and the husband and the son, and because she leaves them behind. But I felt a little sorry for the daughter because she gets robbed from all the youth stuff because mom is doing them.
I love writing that bit. That's yeah. I mean, I think on the whole, the daughter is okay. Although I'll come back to that little bit about. I mean, I think when Phyllis walks through that door into a new life, she's sort of doesn't know she's doing it, but her daughter can follow through after her.
Yeah.
And one feels at the end of the book, I think, that Colette is embarked on her own adventure, which will be bigger than her mother's in a way, because she's a bigger person, perhaps, or she has more future ahead of her, whatever. But you're quite right that I quite enjoyed, I thought it was one of those ironies that there were middle-aged young women who ran away with young lovers and went barefoot and grew their hair long and rolled joints, and it was kind of difficult for their children who wanted to do all those things and outrage their mothers, and there was their mother sat there before them. And in the rivalry between mother and daughter that I'm partly writing in the book, it's very nuanced. The mother is beautiful and Colette isn't, or she certainly isn't at 16 and 17 in the story. And the whole kind of painful power play between them. And then right at the end, I sort of, slightly minor spoiler, when Colette has her lover who actually turns out to have money and he buys her beautiful clothes. And there's just a moment when her mother touches her in one of these Sandra Rhodes dresses and you feel a concession. This is the young woman coming forward now, and the mother yields to her a little. But that's almost a psychic side story to the politics and the life change story.
It is, but it's interesting to follow these two and see how she doesn't want to be her mother, but it's difficult not to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Your mother's been there before you. It's maddening with her body, which maddens Colette so much because her mother's all her mother's femininity is centered in that body which she trusts, whereas Colette can't trust hers, but doesn't quite know how to put her put her power then if it can't be in her body. That's an interesting story about
she has to
mother.
Find it somewhere else.
Has to find it somewhere else.
But did you think when you called it free love, was it meant a little bit ironic?
Of course, yes. But when you look for a title for a novel, and you sort of want to find a ready-made. That's like my very first novel was called Accidents in the Home, like a first aid book, You want to find something, free love. Everybody talks about free love. It's a phrase that's stuck to the 1960s. But of course, when you start to poke at it, free? What does free mean? How could love be free, or could there be such a thing? And even love? What does love mean? So yes, irony, of course. But to find a resonant label like free love, which speaks of the period, but as soon as you start to push at it, crumbles into its constituent parts and seems full of contradictions. That's like a perfect title.
It is a really good title. Thank you very much.